One of my all-time favorite quotes comes from Carl Sagan, and it reads, "For all its material advantages, the sedentary life has left us edgy, unfulfilled. Even after 400 generations in villages and cities, we haven't forgotten. The open road still softly calls, like a nearly forgotten song of childhood." We were wanderers from the very start. We understand that exploring our world comes with risk, mortal danger even. But in the name of science, ego, or sheer curiosity, will overlook those risks and proceed anyway. Tonight, I want to share 3 stories with you. Not about famous explorers, but about everyday people who confronted a terrifying truth lie out in the wild. It can take surprisingly few missteps, sometimes just one, to become utterly lost. Geraldine time ITV voic within minutes, we find ourselves in near blizzard conditions. The wind hurls snow in eerie swirls above. The temperature plummets 10 degrees in just a few minutes. His name was Hans Sailor. He was a husband, a father, a teacher, and an experienced mountaineer. He was also a liar. On April 15, 1954, 10 schoolboys and 3 teachers were set to join him on a hike as part of their 2-week school trip to the Austrian Alps. They had little idea of what they were about to endure, and even less awareness that the entire ordeal would be captured on film. The images you're seeing now would be their final ones. When they were eventually published, they left the world in shock. How could a routine hike go so disastrously wrong? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of teacher would do something like this? But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's start from the very beginning. The morning of the hike wasn't an ordinary one. In fact, according to those who were there, the atmosphere was electric. The night before, Hans had handpicked the boys, aged 14 to 16, based on their physical fitness for a day-long trek up into the nearby mountains. The route Hans selected for the group was tough, but well established. A 14 km hike promising unforgettable views and a challenge for both teachers and students. These kids were only 3 days into their 2-week stay in Obertron, a small but scenic village nestled in the Austrian Alps. They'd traveled nearly 7 hours from their small German town of Heilbronn, which most of the boys had never even left. This trip was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, and so far, it absolutely had been. They'd hiked, climbed, laughed, it was all especially thrilling, because it offered an escape from a town still healing from the scars of war. Plus, mountaineering has always held a strong ideological place in the German collective imagination. At the turn of the century, there was an entire German film genre dedicated to finding oneself on the mountain, the Berg film. Their popularity had faded by the 1950s, but they'd left a lasting imprint. They were similar in spirit to, say, the American Western, except with more beer, lederhosen, dancing, and what you could only really describe as very peculiar-looking goats. I have no idea what's happening in this scene. Anyway, the goats aren't important. But what is important is Germany's seemingly miraculous post-war economic recovery, because it meant tourist agencies began bombarding the public with adverts urging Germans to break away from it all and answer the mountain's call. With Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary's successful Everest summit in 1953, just a year before the boys' trip, mountain mania was officially at an all-time high. And these boys were overjoyed for their first mountain adventure with their favorite teacher, no less, Hans Sailor, who would also serve as their experienced guide, as the group of 10 boys and 4 accompanying teachers, including Hans, left their hostel at 6:00 a.m. sharp. The weather report indicated ideal conditions relatively mild, with some northwest winds, a cloudy sky, and occasional light rainfall. Hans L. or Mr. Sailor informed hostel workers of both their planned route up the mountain and their expected return time, 6:00–7:00 p.m. And with that, They set off for the adventure of a lifetime. By 6:00 p.m., the boys who hadn't been selected for the hike and the remaining teachers had gathered in the hostel's communal dining hall, waiting for the group to return and share stories of their exploits. But half an hour passed, and there was no sign of them. As the remaining students ate dinner, and excitedly and jealously gossiped about the epic adventure they imagined the group was having up on the mountain, teachers and hostel staff began to worry. That day, some unexpected snow had fallen over Obertron, but since the forecast for the mountain had been okay, nobody had been too concerned. Still, darkness would soon fall, so the hostel owner started calling the huts along the group's planned route. But he was met with confusion. Nobody had seen a group matching that description. In fact, they hadn't seen any group at all. All activity had been called off because an entirely unexpected snowstorm, the worst in years, was now raging up in the mountains. The next few hours were filled with panic and confusion as the remaining teachers, hostel workers, and then police struggled to piece things together. Everyone was asking the same question: why hadn't the group turned back? And why was there no trace of them along their agreed-upon route? Surely someone must have spotted them. But the answer, it turned out, was simple: they'd never even set foot on it. One of the teachers had overheard these panicked conversations and was puzzled because the route hostel workers were discussing didn't match what Hans had mentioned in the days prior. And one of the accompanying teachers, who had turned back due to an afternoon meeting, had done so at an inn, which definitely wasn't on the route agreed with hostel staff. It was then they realized the group was in serious trouble. Despite the pitch black darkness, two small but highly experienced search parties went out into the blizzard that night. One became lost, and the other returned in the early hours, none the wiser about where the group could have gone. Early the next morning, with the blizzard still raging across the mountains, the largest alpine rescue to date began. But with freezing temperatures and visibility under 5 meters, progress was painfully slow. Rescuers began retracing the group's steps from the day they disappeared. It was exactly as they suspected. Witnesses confirmed they had indeed taken a path up the mountain, just not the one they were supposed to be on. That day, around 9:00 a.m., the already exhausted-looking group was spotted at an inn on a path several miles from their original route. About that time, the first snow had begun to fall, and Hans was reportedly warned about the incoming storm by the innkeeper. This was when one of the teachers, Hildegard Matz, needed to turn back to make her 11:00 a.m. meeting. The group was later spotted by workers further up the mountain. Assuming they were lost, the workers warned them against continuing and offered to guide them back down. On both occasions, Hans brushed off any offers of help or warnings to press on. And now, I know what you're thinking if you've watched my previous video. Surely this can't be happening again. Surely a well-respected and experienced teacher isn't about to drag his students up a mountain into a storm again. But alas, the bar is in hell, my friends, and in an eerily similar fashion to the English calamity. Just like Mr. Keast, Hans insisted he knew what he was doing and was overheard saying things like, "They're young boys. They just need exercise, and they just have to warm up." Beyond this last sighting at 11:00 a.m., the group's whereabouts were unknown. Despite a massive rescue effort broadcast worldwide, their location remained a complete mystery. That was until 9 days later, on Saturday, April 24th, when rescuers stumbled across something roughly 1 kilometer east of the group's last known location, a makeshift shelter. Following the trail, rescuers continued eastward deep into the mountains. Eventually, they spotted something else in the snow. At first confused, As they drew closer, they realized what it was. A hand reaching out of the snow. Here, they discovered the two teachers who had accompanied Hans. The newly engaged Hans Rupp and Christa Vollmer. They were found lying together beneath the snow, some 3 kilometers east of their intended destination. Nearby, they found the body of Hans and the youngest schoolboy, just 14 years old. The two were discovered on the ground in an embrace, with Hans's jacket draped over them like a blanket. Among the bodies, rescuers found a camera with several photos that would tell a haunting story. Piecing it all together, what happened here was no longer a mystery, and it would turn out that Hans wasn't quite the mountaineer he claimed to be. In fact, hostel workers had warned him to be careful, after he suggested several wildly inappropriate routes in the days leading up to the fateful hike. Hans wasn't happy about this, but following hostel policy, he agreed upon a more suitable route, or so the workers thought. The truth is, Hans lied. That morning, once he was out the door, Severs and out of earshot of the workers, he simply changed the route. The extent to which the group knew exactly what they were getting into is unclear, but they would eventually find themselves in some of the toughest terrain in the area. It's easy to become lost or succumb to a rapid weather change if you don't know what you're doing, and it seems Hans didn't. This was the story the photos told, because it seemed the hike started out fine. The boys and teachers are laughing, but something is off. There's no signage, no discernible path. They're not appropriately dressed, and the terrain looks unforgiving. It doesn't look anywhere close to the kind of hike suitable for school children. Yet, even as conditions worsen, the group presses on. In the final photos, the laughter is gone. They're cold and exhausted. The snow is up to their knees, and then we see the beginnings of a whiteout. The photo you're looking at now is the very last one found on the camera. From here, visibility dropped at breakneck speed. According to some reports, down to just a few meters. At this point, becoming completely lost was inevitable. Now there was really only one question left to ask. Why would Hans do something like this? Looking at those photos, it's hard to know what the hell he was thinking. Though, perhaps unsurprisingly, it would later come to light that Hans had a few notable character flaws, including, according to some, a pathological dislike of authority. While his students loved him, some of his peers were not so keen. Before he left that morning, Hans was warned by the hostel owner about how fickle the weather could be in April, to which he angrily retorted, "Why don't you worry about your own affairs?" As the question of guilt was hotly debated in the media, the families of those lost would initiate a civil lawsuit against the school. But this lawsuit would later be dropped. The question of liability was difficult. This was technically a community trip, one which many from outside the school attended, so holding the school responsible was tricky. Plus, the school administration had some important findings to point the parents to in a not so dissimilar incident that took place in Freiburg in April 1936, where the teacher was found to be, you guessed it, innocent. In the end, some parents felt such a lawsuit would only degrade the tragedy into a topic of public conversation. So they dropped it. Aside from the flurry of reports in the days and weeks after the group was discovered, the question of guilt, specifically, the extent to which Hans's actions constituted gross negligence or even intention to harm, has been mostly ignored. It wasn't until 2014, when some of those present that day were re-interviewed for a documentary later aired on German television, that a darker side to Hans's character emerged. This, for some, cast Hans's decisions that day in a different light. But whether Hans was the kind of person you'd like to share a beer with is, to me at least, irrelevant. because the basic facts have always been evidenced in the archival material. He exaggerated his experience. He changed the route without telling the hostel owner, and he ignored several warnings not to continue. And while it's true that the weather did change rapidly, unexpectedly even, it wasn't the weather that was leading the group that day. It was hands. In the end, perhaps such questions are not unanswerable so much as they are immaterial. After all, as many have argued, hands also paid the ultimate price. And nothing brings those kids back. Haroldtime Vawyc, York-Accemt. The sensation on first going underwater was of such a strange world. You get your head underwater, and all of a sudden the way on looked very, very dark and intimidating. The full history of cave diving is long and complicated, so for the sake of brevity, here's an extremely brief summary. Technically, there was never anything stopping anyone from jumping into an underwater cave and attempting to swim to the next air pocket, except for common sense. To that end, cave-free diving has always existed. But the first successful cave dive with breathing apparatus would be performed by the British, who in 1935 said what I can only assume was something along the lines of, "Hold my beer and watch this," before crawling on their hands and knees along the floor of a submerged section of a pitch black limestone cavern in a pair of 190-pound naval diving suits, one of which had been patched with tape, dragging their breathing hoses behind them and praying they didn't get tangled. They eventually emerged in an air pocket unscathed, and well, cave diving as we know it was born. Cave diving has come a long way since then, and while it has obvious utility in certain fields, it's now also practiced as an extreme sport, of which it is, statistically speaking, the second most dangerous, just behind base jumping, which is the act of literally throwing yourself off any high point of your choosing. Cave diving, in a word, can be wildly dangerous, especially the competitive type. But the cave diving story we're going to look at today wasn't supposed to be like that. It was a simple, straightforward, well-rehearsed dive, and yet it would become one of the cave diving community's most viscerally horrifying stories. It was 1984, and 3 divers were standing confidently at the entrance of Sterkfontein Cave, just an hour's drive outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. A number of incredible discoveries had been made at the cave in previous years, but it was a large, complicated, and mostly unexplored wet and dry caving system, so it hadn't yet been mapped. But Nuno, Malcolm, and Peter, 3 science students at the local university and members of its diving club, had plans to change all that. Having already completed a number of preparation dives in the cave, Nuno would be taking the lead. He'd be guiding Peter and Malcolm through a 125-meter submerged section of the cave via an underground lake where the water would be no more than 4 meters deep. The goal was simple: establish a permanent guideline for future dives. They'd be in and out in less than half an hour. According to Nuno, the dive was so straightforward it was almost recreational. But in spite of its simplicity, there was, to quote Nuno, the excitement of exploration in the air. After all, here were 3 science students about to explore somewhere of exceptional paleoanthropological importance. No one was expecting a fully intact pre-hominid skeleton to jump out and shake their hands, but who knows what they might find. Nuno gave the obligatory pre-dive brief to the group and, armed with 1 torch and 1 oxygen cylinder each, both lasting approximately 70 minutes or so, the 3 made their way inside, with Nuno leading the way. Even though he was carrying 1 spare oxygen cylinder, Nuno admits that, by modern standards, we were probably poorly equipped. Though, to be fair, back then there were no formal courses for cave diving, only common sense rules laid out by various diving clubs and caving associations. After what was about to happen at Sterkfontein, though, that would all change. The first half of the dive went well. The group navigated their way to the small air pocket, surfaced, secured the end of the line, admired the cave's spectacular beauty, and made their way back. It seems that at some point, though, curiosity got the better of Peter, because on their way back, he went off the guideline, something he had, at least according to Nuno, who has described him as somewhat of a loner, been quite prone to doing in their previous dives, which at points had really annoyed his fellow divers. I'm no caving expert, so I asked Nuno if this was breaking one of the common sense rules he had laid out at the beginning of the dive, to which he responded unequivocally yes. He told me that, quote, "When one enters a cave, the water may be clear, but in very tight caves, the silt gets disturbed. Even if you're very careful, soon the water becomes very murky. It's very difficult to find your way out if you leave the line, and there's no visibility." This time, though, Peter got lucky. He would be found just out of view, observing something with his torch. Within minutes, Nuno managed to locate him and guide him back to the line. He wasn't shaken up, so checking everyone was behind him. Nuno continued to lead the group back, through the cave to the room containing the lake where they had begun the dive. And when they emerged, Peter was gone. At first, there was confusion. But Nuno and Malcolm had more than enough oxygen left, so they just went back in to find him. 4 hours passed, and Peter was nowhere to be seen. And then confusion turned to panic, and they eventually called the police. It would be fire brigade divers that arrived, and they took one look at the cave and refused to go in. They had no experience with technical cave dives, so Nuno and Malcolm took their oxygen tanks and went back in once more, while they waited for specialist divers to arrive, which they did at some point late that evening. By that point, Peter had been missing for 10 hours, and the rescue team had become organized chaos. Nuno and Malcolm were exhausted, but they were keen to emphasize to rescuers that the cave system was complex, and that Peter may have surfaced in one of its many air pockets, along many of its unexplored passageways. But by that point, owing to the number of divers that had gone in and out and kicked up sediment, the visibility was practically zero. So Nuno and Malcolm, defeated, went home and left the rescuers to do their jobs. The next morning, they desperately hoped to wake up to good news, but there was none. With all civilian divers banned from entering the cave that day, Nuno and Malcolm and a few others met up with Peter's wife, Shirley. Peter wasn't prone to panicking, they reassured themselves. He was smart, in good shape, an incredibly experienced dry caver, in fact. He'd dealt with much more challenging caves than Sterkfontein. There was still hope that he'd make it out alive. To quote Nuno, "It was really hard to believe that someone could die at Sterkfontein." But any hope they had would slowly fade. With no official map, police were not interested in a possible connection between the wet and dry cave systems. Instead, they kept their searches close to the original guideline. After 6 weeks, there was no sign of Peter, and the search was called off. Peter, they concluded, had long since drowned, but they were wrong. 6 weeks after Peter had gone missing, Sterkfontein was reopened, and Nuno and Malcolm, along with other members of the local cave diving community, headed back into the caves to continue the search. Within a few hours, Nuno had retraced the route and found a connection between the wet and dry caves. Meanwhile, volunteers made their way back down to a previously unknown dry passageway. It wasn't long before they broke through a small hole in the wall, and in doing so, they too uncovered extensive dry passages linking to the wet cave system. As the volunteers began to explore, they noticed something strange on the ground. Taking a closer look with their torches, they realized that what they were looking at was, in fact, human footprints. Eventually, they would come across an opening to a small area connected by a number of dry and submerged passageways. It took them a second before they could process what they were seeing. Because lying there on the ground, next to the water, was Peter's emaciated, lifeless body. Peter hadn't drowned. He'd starved to death. And as they looked at the clues throughout the cave, it didn't take them long to realize how Peter had spent his final weeks. There were marks along the walls indicating that Peter had desperately tried to get the attention of rescuers. His brand new cylinder and regulator were severely scratched from his efforts in trying to squeeze himself through the many tight passageways. And somewhat confusingly, his oxygen cylinder was almost full. Peter had enough oxygen to return, but it seems that he chose not to even attempt it. To quote Nuno, in the fading light, he watched the water's surface while calculating if it would be better to dive and never find his way back again, or sit in the darkness and wait. He chose the latter. With about an hour's worth of light in his torch, for Peter, it was a choice between getting back in the water and hoping to find the guideline again, or staying put and hoping rescuers would just find him. And they almost did. It was later revealed that police divers had surfaced in a submerged passageway just 30 meters away. But for one reason or another, possibly because the rescuer didn't make enough noise, possibly because Peter was attempting to find a way out through one of the other passageways, the two missed each other. It would later be found that Peter had survived for 3 weeks in almost pitch black darkness, the effects of which are terrifying. In absolute darkness, most people begin hallucinating within a matter of days. Now, of course, it was Peter's decisions that got him into this situation, but make no mistake, cave diving is inherently dangerous, and even Nuno's, who would eventually go on to become a world record holder, has lost track of that all-important guideline. In his case, he eventually found himself alone on a rock deep inside a cave, just like Peter. He took a 50-50 guess at which way to go and just took the plunge. Luckily for him, he guessed correctly. But when you're face to face with the horrors of becoming completely lost while deep within a cave, in spite of all the training in the world, in Nuno's own words, it's impossible to completely tame the fear, which could grow second by second at a relentless pace. Everyone has a breaking point when things start to go wrong. There's no doubt about that. It's only a matter of time until the monster hiding in the big black of the cave will come and get you. As Peter's body was removed, rescuers would discover a message scratched into the wall. It read, "I love you, Cheryl and Mai." As a result of the accident, Sterkfontein was permanently closed to divers, and diving courses became mandatory in South Africa. From then on, in the weeks and months after Peter's body was discovered, Nuno was hassled non-stop by media. Racked with what-ifs and unable to concentrate, he had to abandon his studies for the year. The death was eventually ruled misadventure, and of course, nobody was deemed responsible. But even though it was Peter's decision to let go of that rope, as Nuno has written in his book, this is something he'll have to live with until the end of his days. Araipo RTR's mountain, looking out towards Spalding Mountain, and the Appalachian Trail. This is the path that Geraldine Largay would have taken into this valley. What you can see is just a vast wilderness. They are absolutely puzzled as to what may have happened. Chehi Kiar. There's where we just came off of, and there is where we're going. Harnara Atoar, the Appalachian Trail, or the AT, as it's often known, is one of the quintessential American hiking trails, lined with a plethora of sleepy red, brick, trail towns. that tick along humbly amidst the immensity of the mountains and forests that surround them. The trail can be traced along a route of hand, painted directional signage, and wooden camping huts built and maintained by its many volunteers. Less romanticized than its longer and wilder cousin, the Pacific Crest Trail, the AT, offers a more navigable and user-friendly route that's marked by a strong sense of community and an abundance of what is referred to as trail magic. Just like the PCT, however, it has also acted as a sort of emotionally transformative liminal space where people come to live, laugh, love, and light any remaining notions that life is fair on fire. Media tropes aside, it's not exactly a bad plan, because clocking in at around 700 miles over 14 states, if you can't figure it out on the AT, then you are probably out of luck. More than 2,000 people will attempt to hike the trail in full each year, and as whimsical as I'm probably making it all sound, Hikir, if ya fall, ya die! Canara ATOR, make no mistake, this trail is no joke and it's not for the faint-hearted. But 66-year-old Jerry Largay, a retired Army nurse who'd been preparing for months to tick this trail off her bucket list, wasn't faint of heart. Her plan for tackling the Appalachian Trail was simple. She and her hiking partner would start on April 23rd in West Virginia. Her destination was Baxter State Park in Maine. Her husband George, also retired and not really one for the outdoors, would resupply the pair every few days. She was excited. This was a lifelong dream of hers, and she'd been updating her family and friends with her progress in preparing for the hike. Writing in one email, an update from Inchworm, and Sherpa trail names officially chosen? I've picked Inchworm, as that's how I feel going up any ascent. No matter how well I feel I'm doing, I'm always humbled and new on the ups. Sherpa is perfect for Georgie. Except he has a car, not llama. A narrator, she signed off all her emails with, "All the best, Jerry the AT Dreamer." Reading through all the diary entries, letters, and emails she left behind, I grew to really like her. Jerry was the kind of person who put other people at ease. She was funny, and she wasn't afraid to look silly, to sing the wrong words at the top of her lungs, to stitch big clownish pockets on her shorts so she could hold more bird food on a research trip in the South Pacific. Those shorts looked so silly. Remembered her best friend Betty, but Jerry didn't care. If it got her closer to the birds, then so be it. As many of the unlikely friendships she made on the trail would attest, Jerry possessed a streak of radical, almost intransigent idealism that often took people aback. Even if you didn't really think you could be pals with the spry old gal approaching 70, she didn't really care. Jerry started on the assumption that you were interesting and worth the time, even if you didn't think you were. I know what you're thinking. Everyone lit up a room. Yada, yada, yada. But from what I've read, I can assure you Jerry really did. That was, at least, until one rainy day in July when she vanished. Up until that point, the hike had actually been going pretty well, until June 29th says, just 2 months after they'd begun, when Jerry's hiking partner Jane was called away due to a family emergency. Perhaps Jerry should have just given up then, but that wasn't who she was. So, determined, she made the decision alongside her husband George to carry on alone. And then just like that, on Wednesday, July 24th, about a month after Jane had left the hike, and about 3 months after the hike had begun, Jerry'd failed to meet George at their pre-agreed resupply point. Initially, this wasn't a big deal, since it's not unusual for hikers to get held up due to bad weather, for example, and it had been raining heavily. But when there was no sign of Jerry the next day, George understandably grew concerned, and that afternoon he called the police. The searches began that day, and rescuers were initially confident. The statistics were on Jerry's side. 97% of those who go missing on the trail are found within 24 hours after all, and multi-day searches are extraordinarily rare. But those 24 hours came and went, and there was no sign of Jerry. However, it wasn't long before rescuers were able to narrow down the search area. At first, there was a ping from Jerry's phone on Monday afternoon, which was about 7 miles as the crow flies from the area Jerry was supposed to meet George. Not exactly accurate due to the many miles between towers in that area, but it was something. However, it was also discovered that Jerry had spent the evening of Monday, July 22nd, with 3 female hikers, and they had the photo to prove it. Typical Jerry. She'd stayed up chatting with them, and they'd all gotten on like a house on fire, so they remembered her well. Jerry was then supposed to have gone on to stay at a second lean-to on Tuesday before meeting George on Wednesday, but there was no evidence that she'd ever made it to that second lean-to. It wasn't exactly perfect intel, but it was enough. One of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of Maine was about to begin. Hura Iporartir, rangers and aircraft, wardens and volunteers on foot, spent a second straight day searching a roughly 25-square-kilometer section of the Appalachian Trail. And over the next few weeks, the search significantly ramped up. Wardens, volunteers, K-9 units, and even Marines from a nearby military facility were now carrying out one of the largest searches in the history of Maine, in some of the region's toughest and densest terrain. They were working themselves to the bone to try to find Jerry, but the clock was ticking, and if Jerry was still out there, she was running out of supplies. Both media and the subsequent speculation around the case exploded. What if she'd been swept away by a river? Could there be foul play? Had anyone looked closely enough at her husband George? What if there was a killer on the loose? Are other hikers now in danger? Now, most missing person cases will inevitably attract a certain amount of interest, but with Jerry, the speculation felt unusually farcical. The tip line was quickly bombarded by an unusually high number of psychics and clairvoyants who, clearly not satisfied with mainlining the secrets of the universe in private, began inserting themselves into the investigation with suggestions of caves, nearby towers, bears, and of course Bigfoot. Light comic relief for rescuers, perhaps, but mostly just an egregious waste of potentially life-saving human resources. In some instances, these tips had to be investigated, just in case there was the remotest possibility that someone was secretly confessing to something. But, big shocker here, so I hope you're sitting down's not a CNGLE. One of these tips turned out to be even remotely useful. Weeks had now passed. The searches continued daily, and Jerry was still missing. Herar Ipartar. So far, searchers have still found no sign of Geraldine Largay. While authorities continue to interview hikers, post flyers, probe for information on AT, websites and blogs, they admit they're baffled. While they're not ready to announce any end date to the search, they reluctantly know it can't last forever. Ator. After those first few weeks, the mood changed. Rescuers knew the chances of finding Jerry alive were now very slim. Eventually, there was no choice but to drastically scale operations back. But to their absolute credit, volunteers and local rescuers never stopped searching for Jerry. As the winter of 2013 came and went, yet more searches were carried out. And then came 2014. More searches, more nothing. The conspiracy theories grew darker and more outlandish, including one local paper that asked, "Is it just a coincidence that the baffling vanishing of this person took place a stone's throw from a place closely associated with programs designed to make people disappear?" The place he was referring to was the nearby military training facility, and the answer to his question was an emphatic yes. since they had literally been involved in the rescue operations from day one. I can only imagine just how exhausting this non-stop speculation would have been for the family. They just wanted closure. And on Thursday, October 15, 2015, 2 years after Jerry went missing, they would get it. Because that day, a surveyor happened across a sodden, collapsed tent, and they immediately knew who it was. In and around that tent would be a number of personal items, including a diary and a phone. Those items would tell a harrowing story. And to understand it in full, we need to go back to the beginning. On Tuesday, July 22, 2013. After leaving the wooden lean to where she'd had her photo taken, Jerry had walked off the trail to go to the bathroom, but a little further than she normally would, since she no longer had a hiking partner to watch out for her. She stood up, walked confidently back toward the trail, and the trail wasn't there. So she picked another direction. No trail, more forest, and just like that, she was lost. Unable to get her bearings, she began walking in what we can only assume she felt was the correct direction. But it was deeper still into the extremely dense and seemingly endless main forest. It was here that she sent texts. But there was no service. At that point, her plan seemed to be to get to higher ground to either get her bearings or get a signal. Or probably both. Calm at first, but then panicked, Jerry exhausted herself working her way through the undergrowth, becoming more and more lost. Eventually, she would find a small hill near a brook, and here she would send yet more messages. They would all fail to send. There was no phone service for miles. It seems then that she decided enough was enough, no more moving. It was time to set up camp and wait for help to arrive. That was, after all, the general advice hikers are given: if you get lost, stay put. So she did. It's hard to know what was going through Jerry's head at this point, but the incident report indicates that she did make multiple attempts to try to draw rescuers to her location. She set up her emergency space blanket so that it would catch the sun. She set trees on fire, and the diary she kept, which consisted mostly of personal messages, also indicated that she had attempted to use her sweater to attract attention. But it was all in vain. This is where Jerry had made her camp. It was some of the most difficult terrain in the area. She saw the planes flying overhead, but they couldn't see her. The terrain was so poor, in fact, that even highly experienced sniffer dogs couldn't pick up her scent. But there were times when they got so close. By some estimates, as close as 200 meters. When she went missing, Jerry had just 2 days' worth of food on her. Even though she had access to water from a stream, the reality was that it wouldn't have been long before she was battling significant cognitive decline. On August 22nd, 2 weeks after she'd gone missing, Jerry carefully packed up her personal effects and wrote, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me. No matter how many years from now, please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to them." She then wrote her loved ones letters apologizing. She made a mistake, but no hike was as important to her as them. Her last 2 entries were dated August 10th and August 18th. Though Jerry likely had become extremely confused by this point, and that last date is unlikely to be correct. The medical examiner's report would list the cause of death as inanition, death from exposure. Jerry had starved. In the wake of the discovery of Jerry's tent, people were understandably confused. Without full access to her diary, it's hard to know what precisely motivated her decisions. But one thing is clear: Jerry made a number of mistakes, and together they amounted to something much greater than the sum of their parts. For example, Jerry was easily turned around, at least according to her hiking partner, And there is some debate as to whether or not she knew how to use a compass properly. Sadly, even if she did, the tiny toy compass she carried just wasn't accurate enough to actually navigate with. Even though she undertook a number of practice runs, read countless books on the trail, and even sought guidance from trail experts, Jerry didn't actually know any basic survival techniques. For example, she didn't know how to start a fire or keep it going, and she didn't know to follow water downstream. Plus, due to ongoing back issues, Jerry was only able to carry limited gear, and a spot GPS tracker wasn't on this stripped-down gear list. And she didn't stay put from the minute she realized she was lost, but only after hiking for several hours to find a signal. By then it was too late. She was completely lost, and she started to panic. When it comes to surviving in life, or death situations, one thing is clear. Fear is quite literally the mind killer. In the end, the camp was less than 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. If she knew where to walk, that walk would have been around half an hour. But alas, she didn't. I've been thinking about the best way to conclude a video like this, and I've got to say, I've struggled. It would be easy, I suppose, for me to conclude by ascribing blame or with some sanctimonious bit about respecting the forces of nature. But I don't want to do that. So, I'll finish where we started with a quote from Carl Sagan, who said, "Exploration is in our nature. We began as wanderers, and we are wanderers still." Elegantly worded, but I find the corollary bittersweet. Because if we are fallible, destined to make mistakes, to misjudge, to act irrationally or arrogantly, then there is no exploration without the risk of becoming completely lost.